Thanks for joining everyone for this Ask Us Anything. Uh, these are always really fun. I think it's really interactive, and we've got some good questions coming in from athletes today, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end where you can ask either some questions that are hopefully fairly general, but I'm sure will be fairly specific to whatever you're going through. But obviously they usually correlate pretty well to the group. So Elizabeth, do you want to just give a quick introduction who you are?
Sure. Hi, to those of you that don't know me, let's see, longtime endurance athlete turned member of the Fuelin team almost 2 years ago now. Sports nutritionist, so I have focused heavily on endurance sports in terms of female-specific nutrition, low energy availability, REDs, and also really looking at women and performance. And yeah, I have a background in swimming and water polo collegiately, and then did triathlon for years.
Okay, thanks. And Alan, would you like to introduce yourself to the team?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Alan. I've been a dietitian for close to 20 years now. Primarily work with endurance athletes through most of that time. As a practitioner primarily in the sort of the first half of my career, and then went back to uni to get into the academic side of things. So did a PhD, finished that thankfully just before COVID hit, because a lot of PhD students were really mucked around by that. So finished that off in 2019, looking at sort of sodium needs for endurance athletes and how sodium affects us during exercise. And so continue to work at Monash University here in Melbourne on both the teaching and research side of things, and continue to do research in sort of aspects of endurance sports, bit of gastrointestinal stuff, bit of hydration stuff, bit of electrolyte stuff. And yeah, continue working as a practitioner, do a podcast, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
You always sell yourself short, I think, Alan. Just so everyone knows, Alan does work with the Australian Olympic team with their triathletes Paralympics as well. And if you do a PubMed search, which most of you are pretty good at, I think if you search Dr. Alan McCubbin, you'll see a fairly extensive list of research papers that he's been involved with. So he is a wealth of information and knowledge, and certainly Elizabeth and myself are extremely pleased to have him join the team. And we learn a lot from him, so I feel like he can certainly help everyone who's got questions or related to hydration specifically and things like that, but obviously well outside of that, in terms of the world of nutrition. My name's Scott Tyndall. I'm one of the founders of Fuelin, and we shall get going. Okay. So real simple one for me. What is the recommendation for the intensity score or the Z score for every heavy strength gym sessions? Anna submitted this. Look, just put them as Z2, honestly. The main thing with this, look, is that your average heart rate over the course of that gym session is generally going to be fairly low as an average heart rate. The other thing factoring in is that majority of weight sessions aren't going to go over 60 minutes. So it's probably not going to impact too much, okay? One thing we will say about the strength sessions and also swim sessions is that we note that a lot of athletes are not putting in the duration of the strength sessions or the swim sessions. And this obviously has implications for how meals are provided before and after, and obviously impacts total training volume for the week. So what we are looking to implement is we are going to put a default 45 minutes for gym sessions and swim sessions if you do not enter a duration. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We will be just adding that. So it's sort of like a fallback or a default timing. It will at least assist the meal prescription and total caloric prescription for you as an athlete. But if that is not correct, and say you don't have a 45-minute swim, you've actually got a 90-minute swim, be sure to update the duration, because that then will impact the specific pre-fueling and also intra-fueling and post-fueling recommendations. So the accuracy of your program does become, well, is very, very important, not just in terms of the intensity score in the title of the session, but the other details such as when the session starts and also the duration of that session. And further to that, the start time on your sessions is super important, because the other thing is if you've got multiple sessions in one day and all of them are starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, that really messes up in terms of how well we can prescribe for you what you're meant to be eating before, during, and after, because what it looks like is that they're all just back-to-back sessions, which isn't always the case. So again, as an athlete, if you're talking to your coach or you're doing it yourself, please ensure, so if you look at that screenshot on the left, down the bottom, that the details down there in terms of the start time, the duration, and the intensity scores are accurate. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping, but it will significantly improve the accuracy of what we're doing for you. Okay, does anyone have any questions about that? It's all pretty clear. Should be pretty clear.
Scott, I think, what if someone intended on doing a session, because we've had this before, a swim in the morning, and then they don't wake up or something else comes up, so then they have to adjust the time. How does that go about?
Yeah, so another thing that has been happening recently, people have maybe not done the session and then retrospectively tried to change it, and they're finding that they can't update the session. The reason for this is because it's not actually us, it's from the platforms, the training platforms. You can't retrospectively change a session once it's actually been completed. So if you know that you're not going to be doing a session, edit it in Fuelin before that session starts. So the night before generally is when you know what you're doing the next day, generally speaking, or at least before the session, you can then edit within Fuelin and change it to either later in the day or to a following day. We are working on being able to delete sessions. It's just something that we're just going back and forward with the training platforms to make sure we don't delete anything, and make sure that there's a little bit of safeguarding there, so that it's sort of, if you were to try and delete a session, we make sure that you actually really want to delete it and it's not an accident. So we obviously don't want to mess up coaches' training plans. Okay, Alan, your question.
Yes, so this one was around small dose of alcohol and whether that changes sugar getting into the body, which I guess I'd interpret that as sort of carbohydrate digestion and absorption. Look, this is an interesting one. I had a quick look at this morning. Most of the studies that look at alcohol and nutrient absorption are really around chronic alcohol abuse and what happens if you're an alcoholic and have huge amounts of alcohol in your diet. In those, very clearly, it damages the gastrointestinal tract, and that's actually a negative from getting things into the body and results in quite a few, or high risk of quite a few nutritional deficiencies in people that are abusing alcohol. But in terms of small doses, there's actually very little research out there. A lot of it has been done in mice, which also we need to think of as a bit of a caveat. But overall, we're not seeing this effect. In fact, we're seeing probably, if anything, the opposite. So a reduction in the increase of getting carbohydrate into the body. Now, certainly during exercise, you wouldn't want to do this regardless. It would not be a beneficial thing. And at other times of the day, I think if there is an effect there, it's either negative or so small it's not worth worrying about.
Alan, and thanks for that, on the question of alcohol and sugars and things, like, can you explain, so when people have mixes, say like a rum and Coke and things like that, how does that impact sort of blood sugar levels at that point in time? Does the alcohol spike blood sugars when it's consumed together in that sense, or not?
No, it actually tends to do the opposite. So for people with diabetes, for example, where they have to be careful about this, it actually tends to drive their blood sugar down a little bit. And the main reason for that is when you metabolize alcohol, you're going to preferentially store everything else because you're using that alcohol as a source of energy for the time that it's available there. So yeah, you'll feed it into the various cells of the body, whether that's muscle or other cells in other organs, but not necessarily actually using it.
Okay, so And on that, like that common myth of, say, alcohol makes you fat, would you say that's a myth then? Is it more related to what you consume with the alcohol that is probably potentially adding to the weight gain because
Yes
of
and
that
no.
preferential storage?
Yeah, like I think it's a matter of definitions. I mean, alcohol, is used as a source of energy, so it provides calories. So,
Mhm.
a gram of carbs or a gram of protein is about 4 calories, a gram of fat's about 9 calories, and a gram of alcohol is about 7 calories. So it is on the higher end in terms of how many calories you get per gram of alcohol. So from that perspective, it's simply another source of energy.
And you can't store alcohol, can you?
Correct. You have to use it as it is to
Okay.
get rid of it. Yeah.
So if alcohol was being used and protein we can't store and carbohydrates have a limited amount of storage, then is it plausible that, if you're eating a lot of fat, say with that alcoholic beverage, that it would preferentially store that fat?
Yeah, I mean, technically.
Once you get beyond that energy balance equation,
correct. Yeah, so technically correct. I mean, I think sometimes we get caught up on we're using more of this fuel, so therefore we're storing this fuel, and that's either good or bad depending on the scenario. But I think at the end of the day, we've got to look at things, not on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis, but across days and weeks. And,
Yep.
it's just going to be the total balance of all the sources of energy across those weeks that are really going to determine body weight gain or loss, rather than getting caught up on, I'm having more carbohydrate here, so I'm going to store fat, or vice versa, or where the alcohol comes into the mix. Just worry about the total calories and total calories you're using, and over a day, a week, longer, that's going to sort itself out.
Yep. So consistency and adherence to the program is probably a bigger driving force than, say, that individual meal. What I'm hearing.
I think sometimes we overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
Completely.
Just a couple follow-up questions that I think people might have. When we say alcohol, are we talking about hard alcohol, beer, wine, liquor, anything in between? Like, does it matter? Is there a variation between tequila and wine or beer?
Yeah. So, I mean, the alcohol component of alcohol is the same regardless. It's ethanol. And so it'll be dealt with by the body in the same way. But obviously, yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, beer will have less alcohol per 100 mils or whatever it is compared to, pure spirits or something like that. But it also then obviously, depends on what you're drinking it with as well. So then, going back to your point, Scott, with mixers and things, or with beer that might have a little bit of carbohydrate content with it as well, then you've got other sources of energy as well as the purely ethanol part of it. So yeah, depends, I guess, on how much you're having, but also what you're having it with.
And then one more in the studies, sorry, I just think because
no, it's good. It's good.
I've had them ask this before. What counts as an alcohol? Like when they're looking at the studies and looking at alcoholics, is it 2 drinks a day? Is that overconsumption, or is it 4 drinks? Like, how do they define, just so people know what is their glass of wine a night count as an alcoholic or whatever?
Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, certainly those studies that look at sort of excessive or alcohol abuse, typically you're looking, and I know in Australia we have a definition of a standard drink. I'm not sure in the States whether it's the same definition. It's basically 10 grams of pure alcohol is one standard drink, which, 1 can of beer, depending on the concentration, is about 1 to 1.5 standard drinks. But I guess we're talking about probably, 4, 5, 6 plus standard drinks a day, most days of the week, is sort of chronic alcohol abuse. So 1 or 2 drinks a night is not considered that, and that would fit within the, most countries' national alcohol guidelines for, considered safe use of alcohol.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Just people asked.
You're safe, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I'm tequila and wine all the way.
Yeah. Two tequilas is fine. Okay, well, moving on. Your question, Elizabeth. Yeah, your question.
All right. Last week, this is Phil's question. Last week, I followed my plan. I had a 63-mile gravel race on Saturday. I struggled trying to eat that many calories. I did notice an increase in weight gain Saturday before the race. is this feeling of being full and having a slight gain in weight completely normal? I'm going to break this down into a couple components. First, we'll address the weight gain piece because this question comes up a lot. Scott and I both recommend that athletes don't weigh themselves specifically on race week because we are increasing carbohydrate consumption, and carbohydrates carry water, and that will boost the scale up. And depending, on how much carbohydrates you're adding in, that could be a difference. And so mentally, that potentially could set athletes off. So if that's a trigger, then avoiding weighing yourself. But it is very normal when you increase carbohydrate consumption.
So just on that, you said race the entire week. I think some athletes might want to weigh themselves start of the week, but certainly on the morning of race, we would advise not necessarily weighing yourself on the morning of the race, as you said, for that psychological reason. I think that's really important.
And if I think too, if you're triggered by weight, like race week, anything that will get in your head. And I think there are some athletes that very much still believe the leanest I need to be means that I will race better. And so anything that you can avoid putting in your head mentally, that's going to put you in a space, a negative space, and think that implicates or affects performance, the better, I would say. And then, so Phil's saying
do you want to just explain why the weight gain may occur? That's probably important. Just in relation to that race week and the fueling and why they may gain weight.
Yes. So activity levels are down potentially, but increasing carbohydrate consumption, carbohydrates carry water. And so that will increase, you will have some of that water retention, water weight gain. And I think that feeling kind of, if you haven't, which is why we encourage you, 6 weeks out, if you've ever seen the Fuelin chart, we say to practice your 1 to 2 days of carbohydrate loading. It's because we want you to get used to that feeling of being full, that feeling of having more carbohydrates and learning how your body responds. I think in this question, Phil specifically says, I struggled with trying to eat that many calories. So my question would be, did he follow the plan? Has he been following the plan consistently? Has he tested this in the past? Is this a plan that we've worked up to? Because I think if it's just something, if he was new to the program perhaps and hadn't done carbohydrate testing and was dramatically increasing the amount of carbohydrates, then yes, it could have been difficult. If it was something he practiced over the course of weeks, then no, it shouldn't have been a different feeling. Yes.
Phil, why don't you tell us? He's on the call, so we can ask him. Just on mute at the moment, Phil. But yeah, let's just
there.
In terms of eating the calories, are you referring to the carbohydrate load the days before, or are you referring to actually during?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear? So I was on weight loss up to March. Then I was getting really tired of switch order performance. And the last few weeks, I've been eating around the 3,200 mark where you guys had me at. And then this week was all 4,500 on Friday. And it was just trying to get all that food in me was tough. Then when I woke up Saturday still pretty full. And, but the race went well. The nutrition I did was well. All that went well. I mean, it's just normal to eat this many calories on race week because I've never done that before in my life.
So I'll just give my bit, and then I might get Alan just to drop in with a little bit of the gut stuff and that gut training element. But yeah, look, it's absolutely normal. What we definitely want to push with athletes is not being underfueled in race week in particular. So you will see that there'll probably be a change in the amount of fuel you've been eating. If athletes have been on trying to lose a little bit of weight prior to that race week will probably look fairly significantly different in terms of race fuel. But the amount of fuel being provided to you, Phil, is based on grams per kilo body weight. So on those couple of days, definitely before the race, you're going to see at least 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates to get you going. And, you know, depending on your body size, that can be a significant amount of carbohydrates. You know, I'm looking at yours, you know, you're up to sort of, you know, over 650 grams of carbs, which is a lot, you know, and so the point being what Elizabeth was saying is practicing that. It will assist you in finding it, that amount to get easier to consume and how you cope with that. And I'll let Alan just get into maybe some of what that means in terms of from a gut training perspective and the implications of that.
Yeah. And I think this is a lot about managing the carbs, which then leads obviously onto the calories that you're talking about, Phil, versus the volume of food that you eat. And so what we generally find is for athletes, particularly very serious athletes who are doing massive volumes of training consistently and eating, you know, 3,000-4,000 calories a day as just their norm, it's not that big a stretch for them in terms of like the volume of food they need to eat is not that different to what they eat on a day-to-day basis anyway. But for someone who's maybe been in a phase of either deliberately trying to lose weight or just that their training volume is not as high as a professional athlete, then it's a big step up in terms of the amount of food that you actually have to eat when you're carb loading. And so in that situation, what we can try and do is say, well, how can I get that higher amount of carbs, but for the least possible increase in the volume of food I have to eat, because that's what's going to cause that kind of discomfort. So from that point of view, I guess the one thing I would suggest, or a couple of things, you know, how can you sneak that carbs in without increasing the volume of food? So the first one is to look at your fluids. So if you're drinking water on that day, you might as well put carbs in the water. Otherwise, you've got to drink all that water and then have a whole bunch of solid food to get the carbs as well as the water. So put some water in the carbs and you can easily get, you know, 100-200 grams of carbs in fluids without having to eat that amount of carbs. Like that's 2 massive bowls of rice, for example, that you now don't have to eat to get that 200 grams of carbs. So there's different ways you can do that. I often use with athletes just buy like a bag of plain maltodextrin because it doesn't taste sweet. You don't want to be chugging down heaps of sports drink the day before a race. You're going to do that all the next day on race day. You don't want to be sick of it before you've even started the race. So you can just buy a bag of maltodextrin. It's, you know, it's very cheap, doesn't really taste like anything. It's not sweet. Then you can add whatever flavor and however much flavoring you want to it, or not add any flavor if you don't want to. And you can mix up, I'd usually suggest just mixing up a bottle with, you know, 600-700 mils of fluid and maybe, I don't know, 70-80 grams of maltodextrin, sometimes even more if it's you know, dissolving okay. And you can just sip on that between breakfast and lunch. And all of a sudden you've got 80-90 grams of carbs in between breakfast and lunch without having to eat anything extra. And then you can repeat the same thing in the afternoon. You might even have one with dinner if you were going to drink fluid with dinner anyway. And all of a sudden you've got, you know, 250 grams of extra carbs in without having to eat a single extra solid bit of food. The second thing I would suggest on top of the fluids is thinking at the fiber and protein content of the food that you're eating. So, yeah, this is not the day to be having brown rice and whole grain bread and all those sorts of things, because, you know, white bread, wholemeal bread, same amount of carbs, but different amount of fiber. So one is going to be much more filling than the other. And obviously, if we're in a phase where we're trying to lose weight, that feeling of fullness is helpful. But in that situation where you're trying to actually get more carbs in, that feeling of fullness is unhelpful. It's actually making life harder for you rather than easier. So from that perspective, I'd be then thinking, okay, white rice, white bread, white pasta, those kind of, you know, more refined things, the things that we kind of typically think of as quote unquote unhealthy, because most of the time in a sedentary population, it's, you know, it's likely to promote overeating. But in this stage, we're actually trying to eat more. And so we're trying to remove those barriers to doing that. And then I guess the final thing is thinking about the portions of the protein serves, like you're not having a big steak or a big piece of chicken or something the night before. Like keep that small, make the carbohydrate part, the rice, the pasta, whatever it is, the focus of the meal. And then just add vegetables and your protein portion really as flavoring to keep it from being super boring, rather than being the main focus of the meal for that day.
Thanks, Alan. And Phil, if you look at the descriptions in Fuelin as well, you will have noticed leading up to that race, it says exactly what Alan said: minimize fiber content, think white foods. So what you will see in the Fuelin app is actually those exact recommendations: reduce fiber amount, reduce potential FODMAPs if they are known triggers, increase the consumption of white foods, because as Alan, clearly highlighted, they're going to give you more bang for your buck in terms of grams of carbs without that increased bulk. So look at the messages that are in each of the the meal cells, because we will tend to try and help you or guide you with what types of foods to consume at that time. And again, I think like the point about maltodextrin and consuming your calories or carbohydrates in liquid form is a great one, but practice it. Don't do it, don't do that for the first time before your big race. Okay, you probably want to practice that in the weeks leading up, because like anything, it could cause some GI distress if it's unfamiliar. And so it's just, again, repetition and practice with that.
Probably the ones I would avoid in terms of fluids might be using lots and lots of fruit juice as your source, just because of the fructose content may not agree with some people, and also sodas, just because of the carbonation. You're putting all that gas into your stomach, which, if you're having a can of soda, probably doesn't matter, but if you're drinking quite a lot of the stuff, then it's going to add up to quite a lot and not be too comfortable.
Sorry. Okay, Elizabeth.
All right, so this one says, I have used Infinite Nutrition for my race day supplementation. The idea of liquid only to get my nutrients is very appealing. Any insight on whether they have the appropriate balance of nutrition? This is Joey's question. It's an excellent question. So those of you that aren't familiar with Infinite, it's basically a custom blend program. So I would say right off the bat, do they have the appropriate balance of nutrition? It really depends on what you put into your custom blend. So the way that the company works is you go on and you have two options. You can select a custom fueling, or a custom protein blend. And the custom fueling, you get to select flavor, you get to select calories, and then there's like a slider scale where you can do higher carbohydrate, higher sodium, higher or lower carbohydrates. Like you literally choose every bit of your nutrition. And I think I've had athletes that have used it and have had great results with it once they've kind of tailored their system. And by that, I mean, they've used the Fuelin like gels and bars and chews and figured out how much they want to consume in that, per hour. And then they make their mix match with that. The science is pretty clear on 90 to 120 grams of carbs an hour is really what you want. And so if their mixes, if you're making your own and you're going over that or significantly under that, then it's not going to have the impact that you're looking for. They're very specific in how they give you recommendations. The sugars, like they have maltodextrin, I think that's their main component. And so potentially doesn't affect osmolality as much. But again, I like the theory behind creating your custom blend, but I think the problems arise when you start mixing sodium, carbs, and you're starting to play scientist. Like there are enough companies out there that have put the work in and shown like this is the right mix and right blend to have. But I've had athletes that have had a lot of success on it, and some struggle with remembering to eat, or don't have the ability to hold a lot of fuel, or haven't found gels or chews that agree with them. So I think it's an option, but potentially problematic when you're, playing scientist and making your own. I would love to have the Infinite guys on. Mark, I think, is the founder, just to get his opinion behind it. Yeah, that would be my.
Thanks, E. I think it actually makes me laugh, Alan, because it sort of relates to what we were talking about with all these companies. And look, end of the day, do you need to create your own special blend? Maybe you do. Maybe you just rely on the science that's there. And what do we know about carbohydrates and the products that are available that you can readily buy, whether they're expensive or inexpensive, depends on the brand. But looking at what do we know in the science that works, a blend of either glucose, maltodextrin, and some fructose is going to be probably optimal, depending on total amount of carbohydrates you're consuming. If you're not consuming more than 60 grams an hour, and Alan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you could stick probably just a maltodextrin or glucose solution there. If you're going over into that, higher carb fueling, 90 to 120 grams, if you can get to that, obviously, yes, it's gold standard for elite athletes and athletes performing, very well. And obviously we want all our athletes on Fuelin to be performing at their absolute best. So we shoot for the stars. But if you are going into that, then yeah, you're going to need a combination of, glucose, maltodextrin, some fructose in order to get to that. There are plenty of products out there that do supply that in a ratio that is science backed and researched. And so, yeah, I think sort of, find the products that are already made up and find the one that tastes pretty good for you and you can consume a lot of, and you'll probably do just as well. I think the only thing about this question that I probably need to address is the idea of liquid only. It is appealing, and for some athletes, they can tolerate high amounts of liquid carbs, certainly for cyclists. If you're a cyclist only, then liquid carbs, go for it. If that's what you can tolerate, you may just want to break it up with some, gels or chews at periods of time. For triathletes, look, there are many athletes out there, pro athletes, age group athletes, that do perform very, very well with liquid only on the bike and then still have a good runoff. The point being here is you need to practice whatever it is that you're planning on using in a race and feel very comfortable with that on the bike, but with the run off the bike, and that needs to be practiced. That's probably, we bang on about that all the time, but if you are going to go liquids only, just know that, for some people, it has no impact. For others who do suffer from GI complaints and GI distress, and, that is usually typically more females than males. If you are complaining of a lot of GI distress and you are using liquid only carbs, it might be a case of maybe thinking about switching that out for maybe some gels or chews, or reducing the total amount of liquid in that on the bike to assist that. There are plenty of factors related to GI distress and gut training that won't necessarily get right into in this call, but that's what I would say about that. Alan, do you have anything else you want to add to that, like about special blends of carbs and things like that?
Yeah, look, I think, occasionally, because we have Infinite here in Australia, they have an outpost here in Australia as well. And there've been some athletes that have used it, more so probably because, as you said, Scott, you can find products on the market that have, the right amount of carbohydrate, the right amount of sodium, all that kind of stuff. But it's probably when they're struggling to find something that meets their needs from a flavor profile perspective. And so the ability to customize how intense or not intense the flavor is, rather than being locked into whatever the product has decided that's going to be, has probably been more where they've used that. And I guess the final thing, just on terms of the liquid only, is thinking more so about the hydration side of things, that if you're relying on liquids only sources of carbohydrate in very hot weather, that can work quite well, because you can get all the carbohydrate in a reasonable volume of fluid, and possibly still need to drink even more than that, and so you have water to top up on top of that. I guess where it can fall apart a bit is cooler weather races, where your sweat rate is lower, because all of a sudden you have to drink a minimum amount of fluid to get all your carbs in, and that actually may be more fluid than you need. And so either you run the risk of hyponatremia, sort of worst case scenario, or more likely you just need to pee a lot and that's really inconvenient. And so you actually end up over drinking because your strategy requires that to get all those carbs in. So, you know, generally speaking, the cooler the weather, the lower the sweat rate, the slower the athlete, because you'll generally sweat less as well. Then you'll be having to go more towards gels and chews and things simply because you don't need that much fluid.
Yeah, great point. And that again comes back to the actual, if you think of the Fuelin program and us as athletes, you know, remembering, like, understand your sweat rate in the different conditions. So as Alan pointed out, like, do you understand what you sweat in terms of liters per hour, fluid ounces per hour in that cooler weather at that race pace versus the hotter weather on the bike? Because if you've got a very low sweat rate on the bike in cooler temperatures and you're going for carbs only in liquid form, it could fall apart very, very quickly for you. So yeah, great insight and great reminder there, just to think about that when you're putting the pieces of the puzzle together for your nutrition. And that probably relates a little bit to the next question, Alan, and you can explain what Audax is. I actually had to Google it to find out. But yeah, do you want to answer this question?
Yes, so I'm assuming this has come from someone in Australia.
Correct.
Audax is an Australian organisation that runs a whole bunch of endurance cycling events, usually over mountains, usually sort of anywhere from 8 to 18 hours in duration, typically sort of Gran Fondo type events, but usually on the more challenging end of the spectrum. So getting nutrition wrong, hard to track back why. Yeah, it is certainly hard to track back why, I think, unless you have good information about all of those things in terms of what you needed and what you actually got. You know, is this a hydration issue? Well, we don't know how much you lost, how much you drank, that kind of thing. Is it a carbohydrate fueling issue? Well, we don't know how much carbohydrate you actually had. So it's hard to know that for sure. So I guess the first thing is to go into an event like that with a bit of an idea of how much you actually need. So, you know, Scott's already talked about the carbohydrate side of things. There is some situations, particularly kind of the ultra endurance stuff, where the pace is relatively low, where maybe you don't need to go to the extreme of 90 to 100 grams an hour of carbohydrate, because you're actually not burning that much per hour because the pace is a bit lower. I'd certainly say if you're at the competitive end, even in those ultra events, it's possibly still beneficial. And we've seen that trend happening in the ultra trail running scene just in the last few years, actually. Races like, you know, Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, we're seeing the top pros now starting to get in that amount of carbs, where it was previously considered almost impossible to get that amount in for trail running from a gut tolerance point of view and just the duration that you've got to do that over. But they're now starting to hit those kind of numbers in those races. From a hydration point of view, I guess coming back to what Scott said a couple of minutes ago, you know, that having an idea of what your expected sweat rate is going to be in those conditions is really important here, to have some idea of what your expected sweat losses are, because if you don't know that, you're really guessing to a large degree. Now, I think there's definitely a role, particularly in an event like Audax, which is so long, for thirst to come into this. Like if you overshoot or undershoot by 10 or 15% on your fluid needs over 10 or 15 hours, that can add up to a significant fluid excess or deficit, which has potential consequences. So I think to some extent, thirst has to be involved here. But I think you still need to know what your expected fluid losses are, because you need to be able to plan for how much fluid you need available to you at any given time, even if you're on the day, you're not as thirsty because it's a bit cooler and you don't drink as much of it, or it's a bit warmer and you actually end up drinking at the higher end of that. You still need to know what that sort of likely range is. And so doing the sweat test that's in the Fuelin app can be really useful, but I think it's also a matter of, it's not a one-off test. You know, you don't do a one-off sweat test and go, that's my number, that's how much I sweat, because it's going to vary depending on your pace. It's going to vary depending on the weather, both the temperature and the humidity. And so you need to build a profile over a period of time in kind of the range of conditions that you're expecting. So an event like Audax or even Ironman, you know, the weather can change dramatically from the start to the end of the race in terms of the temperature, from, you know, quite early in the morning to the heat in the middle of the day. And so your sweat rate, even if you were doing exactly the same thing at the same pace over that entire time, would vary substantially as well. And so having a bit of a profile of, this is what my sweat rate looks like at race pace in cooler conditions at the start of the day, and this is what it looks like in the middle of the day when it's hot and sunny, is really useful to have that feeling for. And then I guess having fluid available to you that meets sort of the higher end, but being conscious that you don't necessarily have to drink that amount if thirst doesn't help you along the way. Now, the other thing that the Fuelin app has in there, and I haven't looked at it for a little while, so correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you have a rating of thirst in there at the end of the session. And you have
so they can rate their thirst and any GI complaints as well.
Yeah. And so that's really useful information when you do a sweat rate test, because it's not only saying, well, this is how much sweat I'm losing, but it's also, you get a sense from that, am I drinking enough? And if I'm not drinking enough, why not? What's holding you back? Is it because I didn't feel thirsty, so I need to recalibrate my sense of thirst and how much that's telling me to drink or not? Am I held back because I have poor gut tolerance? So I might feel thirsty, I have the need for that fluid, but I just can't tolerate it, in which case I need to go away and do some gut training, practice doing it in training, so my gut gets better adapted to that volume of fluid. Or is it simply that I didn't take enough fluid with me? So it's a planning issue. I actually need to be able to increase my capacity to carry fluid on my bike, in the case of an Audux or the bike leg of an Ironman.
And I think that bit on the practical bit, Alan, is super important, isn't it? Like, if you think of that, he's asking also, how do I carry this? Like, if you think of what you said, like that bottle between his handlebars could be, again, if cycling race, I don't know if they do carry a lot between the handlebars on the cycling, do they? Do they tend to do that?
No, generally not.
They don't do that. So then it's thinking about bottles on the bike. Do they have one on the down tube? Do they have two behind them?
Yep.
Can he rotate that? 4 bottles. Let's theoretically, Morton has at least 80 grams in a bottle. 4 bottles on the bike, there's 320 grams of carbs. If he's then got a bento box on his tube, you can stash in there. If you're thinking just total calories, what you said, pace mightn't be that high. So maybe you're thinking calories. Bars are often really good. They might have 24 grams of carbs, but also maybe 10 grams of fat. A little picky bar could have 190 to 200 calories in it. That could be really useful. Combined with gels, chuck 8 gels in there, there's another 240 calories. Okay, now you're sort of thinking, okay, in the back pockets, he's in a cycle jersey, he could easily have another 2-3 bars in the back pockets, plus a couple of packets of Cliff blocks or chews. All up, like, he could probably be carrying 320, 5, 6, 7, 800 grams of carbs, easy.
Yeah.
On him.
And in most of these
takes
events,
planning.
Yeah, and most of these type of events have checkpoints where you can drop things in bags as well.
Yep.
Or there's just the generic stuff that you can pick up along the way, like an aid station on a triathlon course or something like that. So there are options potentially to have drops along the way where you can pick up things. I think the other thing here is you'll be able to pick up water at those places, so you can carry with you or have at those stations Ziploc bags with the powder of whatever sports nutrition product you're putting in your drinks, and then you can just empty that into the bottle, top it up with water, and away you go. So you're not having to switch just to plain water and then have to rely on solid foods to get all your carbs in, if that's what you're doing currently.
Yeah, I mean, if you're carrying 800 grams of carbs, you've potentially got 8 hours of 100 grams an hour. Like, you've got plenty. You can carry, as you said, Morton does the sachets. I think Precision does the sachets. Other companies do the sachets. They're in your back pockets. You can add that to the water when you replace it. Like, I think more than anything, Brendan, if you do hear this, like, what I would suggest is probably having a consultation with, whether it's one of our team or an expert who can actually help you plan this out properly and go through exactly what Alan talked at the start. Like, we don't know how many carbs you're consuming per hour or what you're capable of, what you actually need, how many total calories, what your electrolytes, what your hydration status is. So it's everything that you should be working out. And you can certainly work all that out within the Fuelin app. But, sometimes having a consultation with an expert will go a long way to saving you a lot of issues. And, when I read you're having to lay down and recover for an hour or mid-event, you're certainly not fueling correctly if that's happening. So I think, a lot of help and a lot of heartache and probably backache and every other ache could be avoided if you get it right.
the final thing I'd probably add on to that before we move on is just thinking about pacing as well. Like sometimes you could have the best nutrition hydration strategy in the world, but if you just go out too hard, you're going to run into these kind of issues regardless of how good your nutrition and hydration plan is.
100%. And that's where I will say, whilst we are nutrition coaches, my experience being a novice to the sport of triathlon and doing my first 70.3, leaning in on my very excellent coach, Lauren Valley, has been an absolute game changer, because I'm relying on the expert of what her expertise is, which is coaching me to do triathlon, and actually all that stuff about pacing and having a plan for each section is a game changer. So, you know, I would say if you're trying to do all this on your own, maybe just, you know, rely on somebody to help you. You don't have to do it on your own all the time. My question, and we have James on the call, which is good. I've been using Fuelin for a month with a goal of losing 2 Ks. My maintenance caloric level is 2,490. Plan, he says his plan should have him eating at 2,000, and we can discuss that, but it has me consistently eating more than that. Instance today, it's prompting me to eat 3,800 calories. Do I need to adjust something in the app? So first thing here was Jane, and this is important just for every athlete, is make sure, and it comes back to what I discussed at the start, make sure your plan is accurate. So what James had in his plan was an extra 9 hours of training on a Monday. So we effectively thought he had 20 odd hours for this week compared to the previous week of 11 hours or 12 hours. That's obviously going to have a huge impact on total calories that are going to be prescribed for you to ensure that you're not under fueling. So first point being, make sure your plan is as accurate as possible. As soon as we adjusted that and took out that extra, I can't remember how many hours it was, that 6 hours or 7 hours for that day, and reran the plan, it obviously corrected in a big way his plan. So he wouldn't be recommended that amount of calories, but as soon as we got the plan accurate, it obviously dropped by about, I think, 1,200 calories per day. James, you're on this. So I think the question I've got for you is, why do you think your plan should only have you eating 2,000 calories a day?
Well, it was just based on my maintenance level.
And your maintenance caloric level.
And also not understanding fully how the Fuelin program fluctuates depending on the workout intensity and volume.
Yeah. And your maintenance caloric level, where does that come from for you? Is that like from an RMR test? You're saying that, like a resting metabolic rate with the factor applied, right? Or okay.
Right.
So, and I think on this, like, yes, you may have a theoretical maintenance calories that you require, but if you just did that, and that's the whole point of why we set up Fuelin, is if you just did that on a daily basis, 2,000 calories, that's going to get me going. That doesn't account for what you're doing on that individual day or the day forward or over the entire week. Because say, for instance, your 2,000 calories was based on you doing maybe 60 minutes of exercise every day, but you're actually doing 2.5 or 3 hours of exercise, you're going to go into a fairly severe caloric deficit pretty quickly. Now, you will lose weight because, you know, as Alan explained, calories in, calories out, it's going to have a difference. If your caloric deficit is, you know, large enough, you're going to lose body fat and body weight. But if it's too big, you're also potentially going to lose muscle mass, but you're also just going to drop into a massive hole. So after a week or 2 weeks of that, which is what often happens to athletes, is it just gets too much. And you're like, I can't do this anymore. I can't train. Performance drops off. Low energy availability occurs. And, you know, chronically, you then go down that route of RED-S or relative energy deficiency. And so what we're doing with the program is looking at your training volume and making sure that actually we could still apply a deficit to that, but relative to the amount of exercise you're doing, that deficit is going to be adjusted in relation to the exercise you're doing. Does that make sense? And I think you saw that when we readjusted your program, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. And so there are a lot of calculations going on in the background. I think there's about 70 calculations per day for you just to see red, yellow, green in that and understand what your macros are for each meal. But it is, all related to the actual work you're doing. Okay. So yeah, it is tough as an athlete to understand. And that's obviously why we created Fuelin as well, to try and assist you in understanding and starting to see patterns of how much you require in order to fuel, the exercise you're actually getting through. And it's not a simple case of just, as you did, maybe adding up protein and carbs and fats and going, well, that should be my base level. We're also factoring in, obviously, your goals, your body weight, but then the exercise that you're actually doing.
And I just wanted to mention with the training volume discrepancy, I now understand that it pulled over the event information from Training Peaks. And I didn't understand how that was going to happen. And so then, because I was tracking with Wahoo, it uploaded to Training Peaks the individual event information, so that it got doubled up.
Yeah. So I think what happened there, and so if you are an athlete, and I don't know how it works specifically for you, but if you are an athlete doing a race, what I would emphasize, there is a video in the Learn section. I think it's on the second row down. It's the first video of how to create a race event. What you want to do is create a specific race event in Training Peaks or today's Plan or Final Surge. Don't create it as individual sessions. Now, I don't know whether it just pulled across the individual sessions retrospectively. And maybe, I'm not sure why that happened. We'd never seen that before. But certainly for athletes, don't create individual sessions for your race. Just create it as one event. And make sure the duration and the session, the name of the session, the duration and the distance are included in that event details. And then we'll know exactly what the race is and prescribe the correct fueling for that.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. I know we're getting close. I didn't think we'd be anywhere near this time. Alan, your question?
Yeah. So talking about training the gut, is there a way to train your bladder in terms of having to pee a lot? There's probably two parts to this. One is the actual bladder side of things, and certainly you can see this both male and female athletes, probably more female athletes, where it could be pelvic floor related, and that can be both over and underactive pelvic floor. So it can be particularly, for mums that have had kids in the past, it can be about underactive pelvic floor. But in some athletes that do a huge amount of sort of abdominal core work and things like that, gym, it can actually also be overactive pelvic floor as well. So that can be, I guess, the control of sort of bladder release. But I guess the other part of this is actually how much urine's being produced by the kidneys in the first place. And so there's a couple of parts to this. And I know there was a second question, which I'm not sure has made the slides. It might be on the next one about sort of being in the water swimming and then having to pee shortly after getting out of the water as well. So yeah, so basically the kidneys are going to respond to two things in the blood. One is how concentrated the blood is in terms of the water relative to all the bits that are dissolved in it, which we call osmolality. And the other part is the actual volume of blood. And so obviously the more hydrated we are, the bigger the blood volume, the more, or the less concentrated, I should say, everything else is, because there's more water relative to the dissolved bits within it. And so both of those things are going to signal to the kidneys to produce more urine. So from that perspective, I guess the first question is, is it genuine overhydration, in which case the kidneys are doing their correct job of getting rid of excess fluid from the body? Or is it potentially, in some cases, it can be related to, getting out of the water, which was one of those other questions that we had, or it can be related to, particularly probably more so later on in a race, is drinking a lot of water and just diluting all those solutes, even though the volume has dropped because you've sweated out a lot during that time. If that does happen a little bit, what you can think about doing is possibly even adding a bit of extra electrolytes prior to the race. That'll actually add more of the dissolvable bits into the blood and concentrate that up a little bit more to, tell the kidneys to produce less urine. Doesn't work in all situations because the body's pretty clever at compensating for all these things. We try to hack it and do all sorts of things to manipulate things around. But usually within an hour or two, the body kind of is smart enough to see what we're doing and work its way around our feeble attempts to trick it. The other one you can use is something like glycerol, which is used to actually try and preload with extra fluid. For some elite and professional athletes will do that before, say, marathon in very hot weather. That's been used sort of athletics world championships, the marathon at the Tokyo Olympics and that kind of thing. That is a potential strategy. I guess with both of those, the risk is if you put too much of those dissolved parts into the blood, the opposite will happen. The body thinks that you're dehydrated and you'll feel exceptionally thirsty and pretty awful. So I think if you're going to go down either of those strategies, you probably want to get some professional help with those, because if you get it wrong, it can go really wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Alan, I'm glad you pointed out, Elizabeth and I actually had this chat about like this question, and we're talking about like, bladder training, and the pelvic floor obviously was one thing we flagged. And when I put my physio hat on, it is something, unfortunately, and as you said, females can tend to suffer from it more, especially if they're postpartum and they've had issues with childbirth or anything related to pregnancy. So if that is something that you have this overarching sort of urge to pee a lot, or if you cough or laugh and you lose urine, then it certainly could be something to see a specialist physiotherapist about. If you are a woman, see a women's health physio, and they certainly will do, I remember working with one in London, and she was fantastic. She would do internal examination and really help a lot of women out with issues. And it's a muscle, like we talk about the gut, but it's a muscle as well, and you can train it. And whether it's underactive or overactive, it is possible to make significant changes to the control of your bladder through exercise therapy and physiotherapy and whatnot. So I think that is, when we remove the nutrition hat, it could actually be something physical that needs to be addressed as well. We're right on 11 o'clock, or 11 o'clock Australian time. I don't know what time it is in America at the moment. 6 or something, isn't it? 6? Is that right?
6, yeah.
6, yeah. So what we might do is actually just say good night and save up questions that you might have for the next one, and you can certainly submit those via the link that we used for these questions. Pleasantly surprised that actually we didn't have too many questions, but still managed to have a great conversation and cover a lot of the information. Hopefully we answered all your questions and hopefully generated a lot more thought about certain topics that we've covered today, and certainly keep the questions coming. We love doing these ones, and they're always super informative, and I learn just as much as probably everyone else on here through the team. So if you can fill in the questionnaire at the end of this call, that's always really greatly appreciated, just for further information. And other than that, I think we'll sign off. And Alan, great to have you on the first Q&A. Very informative and wealth of knowledge, so thank you. And Elizabeth, as always, thank you. And to everyone else, lovely to see you all, and thank you for your questions, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
You can't hear me. Sorry. Thank you. I'll see you in a bit. Well done, Jenny. I haven't spoken to you in a while, but well done on your race. That was good.
It was great. It was great.
Yeah, it was